We are really clamping down on Cuba. Tell us about this article. Tell us about what generated.
Yeah, thanks for that. So um, I try to write cautiously. It doesn't reflect the seething rage I have about what we're doing to Cuban people and people elsewhere. But because though a lot of people probably feel the rage that I feel, undoubtedly they feel the rage. It's less analytically useful when we're trying to figure out, hey, okay, so what's happening? How should we approach this? What should we do? Should we be in solidarity with Cuba? And it's a tough challenge because narratively, the Cuban people are not visible, and through a lot of structural things that have been in place persistently since 1959, irrespective of the regime, irrespective of the political climate, these things have remained in place, and they're resistant to the kinds of rationality that we would think would make sense, right? If people are suffering, if people are dying, Cubans are not attacking us, then why doesn't this policy change? So those are the kinds of questions that sent me to school. I was like, well, why does this, why does this happen? And so when you look at it structurally, a number of things pop out at you. The first that I mentioned is that the Cuban people are not narratively visible. In other words, in media discourses, in punditry, there's no assumption about what's happening with the Cuban people. It's all about the quote unquote regime. And because the regime is coded with words like communist and even the word regime, it's then they're a presumed enemy of the United States, and therefore the people don't get the kind of narrative exposure that you might until something brings it to your attention. And the most proximate example that I have of this is Palestine. So what's been going on? Palestine has been going on since 1948, and to one degree or another, and but it was not visible to people. And even after the quote unquote Al Aqsa flood event, even after October 7th, um, for many months, people were still not understanding the plight of the Palestinian people at all. They were not seeing them as people. They were seeing them as terrorists and Muslims and um, racist, kinds of language used to describe them. And it wasn't until sometime, really until Israeli soldiers began to post things on TikTok. And we began to understand, hey, these bombing campaigns you're bombing tents with, filled with children and women who were not combatants. And you're making all these rationales. So then they became temporarily visible, right? And I say temporarily because if you've noticed that we're back to the same kinds of routines in Palestine.
Mhm. I
So the
mean,
Cuban,
Marco Rubio
yeah,
just referred
yeah,
to Palestinians as barbarians
yeah,
in
yeah.
his speech at Munich last a week or
Yeah.
so ago.
Yeah.
There's so much this troubling about Marco Rubio and his characterizations and his analysis. Um, his so you're making the point that that it reinforces the point that um, the people who are at the business end of U.S. policy oftentimes are not visible to the public. What's visible, what's legible to people are these characterizations, these broad overarching, all of this language that is othering other people, in a way that says that they're not worthy of consideration. And then there are other situations like with Haiti. We don't even consider Haitians at all, and what's happened there. We don't consider Congolese. We don't consider what's happening in the Sudan, really, in Western media and in those kinds of discourses, except just on a surface level. And a lot of that has to do with race. If you are racialized in a certain way by Western narratives, if you are a poor nation, supposedly, and I say that, poor in quotes because these are resource rich areas that if they were to monetize their resources would be among the wealthiest people on the planet in a lot of these places that we are calling poor. So a lot of what I'm describing, Jim, is talking about the power of narratives to determine whether or not the people are visible in these analyses that we're being exposed to through media.
What was fascinating about that article is that you connected that what we're doing to the Cuban people to what the United States government has been doing to black people for centuries.
Right. And so you want to be careful. Anytime you're trying to draw parallels, you have to be careful because these are not, you don't want to create false equivalents. Like, I mean, I invoked Palestine just as an example, but it's also true in terms of a policy. The way that the United States has dealt with um, Black Americans throughout the history of Black people in America has been through a regime of scarcity and and deprivation. And so it becomes normalized in a way that that too, like the people of Cuba have been invisibilized by the narratives, so too is the policy have been obscured in this kind of language that normalizes things, that makes it seem normal and acceptable. Um, so the things that have been happening with Black folks in America, for example, with redlining, that's such a benign kind of framing of things. But what it is wealth extraction, and so you're
Mhm.
really extracting wealth from Black people, and preventing wealth accumulation through real estate policies, through financing policies that limit what Black people are able to accumulate um, on average. And then you have other policies that, with regard to healthcare, with regard to jobs, and in any number of ways that Black people interact with America, we are often subject to limitations and scarcity as the norm. And so, and it's true also with what we benignly call sanctions. It's like non-kinetic warfare, like I said, because if there are no bombs going off, then how bad can it be, right? Well, you
Mhm.
mentioned at the top when we're talking about, these sanctions have limited financing, they've limited food distribution, and importantly, fuel. Fuel is required for um, uh, water plants. For the production of clean drinking water. It's required for food production. It's required for food delivery and transit. And so it's required to you know to for healthcare, for all kinds of things. And so it's a very targeted, very specific way of killing people without appearing to do so. And so, in the same way that Black Americans have been subjected to those kinds of regimes, not in the same way, but similarly, Black people in America have been subjected to those kinds of regimes, as have the people of Cuba. And now, in a very targeted, very sinister way, in my assessment, the people of Cuba are being punished collectively, and it begs the question, for what? Why are they being punished? What is this? Why are they being tormented and subject to this kind of, of existential crisis?
Mhm.
I think,
Well,
one problem with Cuba is, through all these years of embargo and sanction and one sanction on top of another and secondary sanctions against anybody else who had anything. In the meantime, they have, a better life expectancy, lower infant mortality rate, higher literacy, higher vaccination rate. Their biomedical sector is unparalleled anywhere. Uh, and we miss out on a lot of these benefits because we can refuse to have anything to do with it. The rest of the world is really benefiting from all that. And, the one thing the U.S. can't tolerate is a country that's succeeding without, uh, you know, following their idea of what uh, the country's supposed to do. Be capitalistic, and private enterprise is the key. And so they're in the living. It's a little bit like the VA. They're too successful. They do too good a job.
Harvey, you said a mouthful. I mean, so the the fear of the good example, right? I mean, during COVID, when everybody
Yeah,
was hunkering down and having problems, this poor, deprived island nation was sending doctors all over the world, sending vaccines all over the world.
mhm,
When the U.S. was trying to monetize,
mhm.
making sure that they did not distribute vaccines, Cubans came up with a couple of different vaccines that were effective, that were
Very
clinically
good. Yeah,
very
they
effective.
had they had the lowest rate of COVID deaths for a long time until the new variant came on, and we blocked syringes so they couldn't vaccinate their population.
So Harvey, why, as I would turn it back to you. Why is this happening? I mean, because I look at it and I go, wow, these are some benevolent people. They're doing great work all
Yeah.
over the world. What's happening? Why is this happening?
Well, their sin was the revolution. You cannot do that and expect not to be punished and never forgiven by the U.S. And that's sort of what it boils down to. I mean, what the U.S. wants for Cuba is for them to return to the status of an economic colony of the United States, and that's what we had before. And
and so how do you get out of that? How do we get out of that mindset? How do
yeah,
you get out of that mindset with our buddy Narco Rubio? So because he's the ideologue.
So
yeah.
so
I'm
one
going to
of the
mention
things.
a sanction. Uh, I was getting ready for this, came across thanks to DeepSeek, I came across an interesting article from the Lancet Global Health Report talking about sanctions being framed as some kind of nonviolent means of coercion, short of warfare, but is every bit as deadly, if not more deadly, than warfare. They said since 1971 to 2021, they estimate 38 million deaths due to sanctions. And just since 2015, they've averaged 560,000 deaths annually. Majority of deaths during sanctions are children. People don't, they don't bat an eye when they hear sanctions. They don't think that's a big deal.
And so part of what I'm trying to do with this, with my scholarship and the public kind of articles that I'm producing on Substack is to sort of challenge that, to have people think about what these things actually mean. It's, what's in the news today, Iran. And so they've had these sanctions imposed on them. In addition to sanctions, Scott Bessent admitted that the Treasury has been manipulating the currency of Iran so that what these things do is to limit life possibilities. If you think about sanctions and currency manipulation in this kind of economic warfare kind of way, that it sounds benign, but this is really limiting the life possibilities of people, and immediate in some cases, causing deaths, and especially as you mentioned, of children.
I was just noticing in your article, you say hardline sanctions policy is not driven primarily by humanitarian concern for Cuban lives.
Right.
It is sustained by domestic political incentives, ideological commitments, and elite networks whose governing assumptions about discipline, order, and economic coercion mirror logics deployed elsewhere, including within the United States itself, the same state that manages populations through scarcity at home asserts the legitimacy of scarcity as a weapon abroad. So I guess the question, Craig, in your study, have sanctions ever worked other than to kill children?
Well, that's the question, right? So, ostensibly, the policy of the United States toward Cuba post-revolution, and to be clear, the revolution was, against uh, the Batista government and the corporate and mafia kind of leadership and dictates that were existing on the island then. It wasn't against the United States, but since the revolution, various things have been tried, but the embargo has remained, sanctions have remained over time uh, through generations. And it'll be close to 70 years now.
Yeah.
That this so the attempt has been to oust the Castros. Well, Fidel died.
That's
He's
right.
he's
Yeah.
gone.
And the
Not that the
revolution did not
CIA
fold.
didn't try to kill him for the 50 years.
They tried to kill him, and yes, including so they tried to sanction. They tried to Bay of Pigs and other attempts at assassination and undermining. And yes, the as Jim says, even though Fidel died, the revolution did not. The people
No.
there of Cuba are supportive of the revolution. They understand. They understand what's happening. They understand the nature of their enemy, and they don't really consider the American people their enemy. What they consider their enemy is capitalism. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to support uh, their beliefs. To answer your point, Jim, it hasn't worked in 70 years, but we
Right.
keep going. So it has not overthrown the Cuban Revolution. Nicaragua is still clocking along. Venezuela, even after um, Nicolas Maduro and his wife Cecilia Flores were kidnapped, Delcy Rodriguez and the Venezuelan people are still supporting the Bolivarian Revolution, the one thing that did work was the CIA support of Augusto Pinochet over in the ouster and killing of Salvador Allende in Chile.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really have to go to extremes in order to change these things. And sanctions is not one of these things that has turned the tide in America's favor in many places, if at all. I mean, if you look at after uh, the CIA and British intelligence ousted Mossadegh from Iran. They installed the Shah, and then you had the revolution in Iran, and those sanctions, and these things just don't work. I think the best hope for the Cuban people are the American people who are fed up with this stuff. To the extent that we begin to organize ourselves and mobilize around this issue, recognizing that a necessary solidarity with the people of Cuba, with the people of Venezuela, with the people of the world. Um, I think that that is really the hope of the world, that that we will do something here. Um, Otherwise, it's very difficult and challenging um, for other nations to get involved. And so and I'm not unhopeful about that anymore. One of the things that we participated in leading was were the recent general strikes up in Minneapolis, for example, based on what was happening with ICE. And so, um, we I should not give you some operational details, so I won't. But we participated in both the January 23rd and the January 30th general strikes, which were successful. And guess what? ICE is hightailing it out of there because in a capitalist society, one of the biggest threats is this kind of non-cooperation of labor, if or the so-called general strike. If labor does not cooperate, and that's a big, 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 big threat. And so there are a number of things that people are fed up with. But there are a number of things that people are engaged in that are non-economic. I mean, there was a San Francisco teachers went on strike. I don't know how many people knew about that, but they won. They
Yeah,
held together and they won concessions. But
yeah,
it's not just about that anymore. I mean, so
yeah.
people struck based on what was happening with ICE, and so I think that these kinds of global interventions, to put it politely, that we're engaged in with our military and our this kind of adventurism, this imperialist behavior, and that we as veterans are especially sensitive to, understand that this there may be some things that we can do on our end to be supportive of the people of Cuba and other people who are other peoples around the world who are under this kind of threat and dynamic.
I think you finished up your article with either a question or a statement that the Black community should stand in solidarity with the Cuban people.
Right. Yes. And so it wasn't even it's not really a request. It's like, look,
Yeah.
we should stand in solidarity with the Cuban people out of recognition. We recognize what's happening to the people of Cuba because it's in many respects it's happened to us over and over and over again in various forms. And so solidarity does not mean that the experiences are the same or that the cultural identification is the same. It does not mean that your race is the same or that your language is the same. What it means is that you recognize that there's a structural similarity between what's happening with what's happening with you historically and what's happening to the people who are affected by these policies that are destabilizing at best and murderous, in many respects, if you really pull back the curtain to examine it.